All right, joining us this week on The Informed to discuss the cost of living, we've got Mario Beeks, security consultant, former military Croatian officer and author of Blood and Soil. We've got John Heron, victims of crime advocate and solicitor. We've got Ian Cook, the director of iCook Foods and the infamous Sludgate scandal. And we've got Caroline Council, one of Australia's leading family law experts. Good morning, team.
Good morning.
Hey, Michael.
Now, something I never thought in my life, but then again, too, I've got to be honest, I never thought that toilet paper would have been the issue that it was in the first one, lockdowns. And now it seems that lettuce has become the new harbinger of doom. Where are we? What are we doing as a country?
Well,
We're not
to
growing
talk about
lettuce.
the inflation rate, getting on straight onto that, is tracking around 6 to 7%, and that's the same in the US. So overnight, the US jacked up rates 0.75% and dwarfed everything else. So it's a global situation with a whole lot of factors, as we know it down in Australia, food and energy. But yeah, this is just the start of it.
Yeah, and there's that saying too, John, when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. And given China's propensity to lockdowns and the impact that has on supply chains, it doesn't look like it's going to get any easier anytime sooner.
It doesn't look like that way. I just reading this morning the article from European newspapers, and Zakharova, was a spokesperson of the Russian Duma and the President Putin, and she says what the West actually did with all this crisis with the sanctions, not exporting oil, not importing oil, gases, and everything else, that actually Russia increased export to the China, Asia, and Africa, while the European Union and US, will suffer because they can't diversify enough. And this crisis is going to deepen even more. It's not something what we didn't expect. As soon as we start doing these sanctions, it's just domino effect, as John and I elaborated last week. It's just, you have not enough wheat from Ukraine, it's going to just fall and roll on other country as a domino effect. And this crisis, I can see it's going to be longer than we can actually anticipate. Let's just say 12 months down. I think it's going to be much, much more longer amongst us.
Putin may have invaded Ukraine, but I don't think that he would have or would be regretting the actual impact or destabilization he's managed to have on the rest of the world. I could see him sitting there go, well, wasn't the focus, but gee, not such a bad outcome.
Yeah, I'll take the win, basically.
Now, what levers do we have here in Australia? Like, what can we reasonably expect of our government to do to help us?
Increasing the taxes. Yesterday was increased minimum wage. Minimum wage to the, I think it's 5.2% or 5.6%. I'm not sure. Don't hold me now.
At 5.2, Mario.
Yeah, as much as doesn't looks like a lot, but what Labor, and I said this in previous our shows, Labor is not a government who can run the businesses around the government, because they never work in the business and never work at all. And that's going to create a big impact now on the small businesses. And I can see, including my one, that's something you're obliged to fulfill. But when you speak about leadership, what leadership? As soon as on the power, we have the energy crisis, we have the tax hikes, and now increasing the minimum wages. So I can see that there's this government, it's running into the taxes and increasing more taxes.
And throw in on top of that the increase in superannuation coming next month as well.
That's another one. And that's create a lot of impact on the small and medium businesses. And I can see this because after 2 years of the lockdowns, you are now aiming that you're going to get more money, more momentum from the small and medium businesses. That's a wrong calculation. But as again, I could be wrong. So John and Carlon and Ian can correct me on that one.
Yep.
You're right. Go ahead, Ian. You haven't spoken.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I don't think he's wrong at all. I think these wage rises put in place, one of the arguments was that the cost of living has gone up, not just fruit and vegetables and contaminated lettuces or whatever caused the problem. The big issue are the domestic issues of power bills, etc. Now, Australia should be self-sufficient in this area. You know, people like Daniel Andrews won't allow exploration for gas, which is apparently one of the clean energies. So if we're not going to look after ourselves, then we have to expect that we're a net importer of fuel oils, etc. We're going to be in strife, and we're going to keep paying for it. So you say, what can government do? Government can start legislating to make sure that Australia becomes self-sufficient in these areas.
Well, the difficulty, of course, Ian, is we gave away food security and we gave away energy security without ever planning for this day. So it's been successive governments and poor planning, in my opinion. But I agree, Dan Andrews, it's a no-brainer, right? You should be able to explore gas. As you say, it's one of the clean energies. Why on earth are we not doing that? Why on earth aren't we permitting it? So
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
yeah.
Look, it is talking about gas. It is cleaner, so
Yes.
its emissions are about half.
Richter
of what
scale.
coal- Yeah, no, it's about 40 to 45% of what coal emits.
Yeah.
So there's that component of it. But an issue that Mario raised, which is very interesting. So what can the government do? Now think about this. It's all about signaling, right? So use this signal to business that you're going to hike their cost of production, labor, fixed costs, compliance, all these types of things. Now, if you're running a business, what are you going to do? You're going to go out and hire more people? I don't think so. So you're going to tighten your belt there. So that's going to crash down on you. What else can they do? Already the RBA, which is independent, has signaled that they're going to raise rates continuously until inflation's under control. We don't know where that will stop, but certainly like rates in the 2 to 3% level, highly likely. What can they do? As I said, legislate in the labour area. Well, that's just gone against inflation when you've imposed that cost of. Now, you mentioned Daniel Andrews. Look at all the wage hikes around penalty hours at the end of last year. If you run a business, you are aware of that. There's no doubt about it. And the media might have forgotten about those things, but and you can ask Ian this: as you're a business, would you expand?
Of course not.
That's right. There you go. So,
And what
Well,
we're going
and
to
the other thing.
sorry, Ian.
No, all I was going to say is the other thing too is that unless you have to operate then on weekends, etc., you're not going to operate. So you restrict the hours that you operate and what you do to meet the minimum requirements. Putting wages up sounds great and it's all good and well. Businesses who make profits are just somebody else's wages. And the idea that every business out there is some sort of mega rich business owner who can afford it is just garbage. And anyone who subscribes to that is living in a fool's paradise. They need to understand that by increasing the minimum wage, okay, so you're trying to help the most vulnerable, what happens then is that every wage above it also goes up pro rata. And all you do is fuel inflation. And then you get higher interest rates. That'll put pressure on mortgages. And the whole thing becomes a vicious cycle.
I remember, like Ian, I couldn't agree with you more. Again, I need to use my background. I was born in the wrong society, and I had this poverty, had an inflation, standing in the front of the shops in 80s for 12, 14 hours waiting with my mom for one kilo of the sugar or the lettuce or whatever it is. Well, now I've seen this again in my lifetime. But what I'm seeing, the problem, we can't hire the manpower now. We have the shortages, and with that now hike of the wages and the taxes, it actually reminds me of the 80s in communism, where the government actually explored that one to increase the wages by printing more money, and its inflation was becoming worse. I don't see where we're heading with this one, but where the major problem I see, and that's the issue. So feel free to correct me. We can't think old way in 2022. This is 2 years after lockdown, and we can't apply the same style of economy where the logistics in disarray across the globe and everything, it's price of cost living, it's rising. Same thinking 3 years ago on today, landscape of the business of economy. We cannot do this. We need to have the new model and rely on the new researches and what we can actually do to make this economy survivable during these economic problems and inflation.
Well-
Couldn't agree more, Mario, because otherwise we're just going to see the same cycles repeat themselves. And it's not just going to be the case of all wages going up. It's, as business owners, what's going to happen is the cost then gets passed on to the consumer, and that is part of the vicious cycle as well.
Yes.
You know, you're seeing people in key areas on the Queen's birthday weekend just gone, key tourist areas on the Queen's birthday just gone, not opening on the Monday because of penalties, because of the cost. We're already seeing resizing in the commercial world, but I've also seen resizing of commodities, if you will, on the shop front, on the high street. It's already started. It's already happened, Mario. That cycle. We need a new model. We need to think outside the box. I agree with you.
Now,
The problem is that we don't have any political leadership across the country to do any type of planning. So that is absolutely out the window. And if you want any more examples that, well, it's very topical, is the debates going on around energy generation. All right, they're absolutely nonsensical without any engineering or any type of planning or thought. I think just before we switched on, I said, if you want a new gas generator, remember I referred to that peaker gas unit in Newport? That would take about 10 years to generate, to build that. Nuclear would take about a baseload station, even coal, about 15, 17 years to get on track. What are you going to do in the meantime? Some of the debate coming out of the federal government, things like Bowen absolutely slamming anything to do with nuclear, because the Australian public's been indoctrinated with this stuff over decades. So politicians are not going to go against that. So what you've got now, price hikes, rolling blackouts, only going to get worse.
Yeah, I think what happens too is the condemnation or the aversion to nuclear is the same aversion to renewables 10 years ago. Technology's moved on. Like what we're basing this aversion on is 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl and all these things where we've gone, you know what, we're so much better at it now. So that aversion to it is misplaced. Just as
dams and water supply. Does everyone know when the last dam was built in Australia? I'll help you out. 29 years ago, the Hinds Dam on the Gold Coast, right? Now, believe it or not, some of the green movement is celebrating that hydro is now generating a lot of, like about 10 to 12% of power from the East Coast at the moment. Now, that comes from so
yeah. And what about the dam that we stopped in Tasmania that could be firing base load across to Victoria?
Well, I'll get off the subject, but the connector between Tasmania and South Australia is generating, Tasmania and Victoria is generating all hydro. So, but there's other potential for hydro around the country. That's true. But again, Australia's the driest continent. We can't rely on that. That's a tiny stopgap.
I agree.
I don't understand why not nuclear plants. You know, if you can buy the 5 nuclear submarines, fill it with Tomahawk missiles with the nuclear warheads or whatever they are, you know, like Australia should have that. And you know, you might be right. It's not 1986 and Chernobyl, and you know, let's go make it clean. You know, what I mean, that there's no same technology be used in USSR and the Western society. So why we don't using something which is more cheaper and more reliable? And instead of this, we have the, you know, exporting all this uranium and other minerals, you know, for other countries. France is increasing number of nuclear plants, Germany increasing number of nuclear plants, and yet we are, in Australia, we're going to rely on what, you know, what did you say, John? If I want to buy a generator, how long need to wait? Now 10 years, right? Or something.
10 years for a small gas one. But so the last one built here is 30 years ago. That's the other thing too. So all of those other countries are building, they use coal power plants for peakers, Indonesia, all throughout Asia, particularly China. We haven't built a new one. And they're going to be slated for decommissioning as well. Angus, well, I forget his surname. I went to uni with him. In federal parliament, had a plan for transition to renewables with gas, which was quite a good plan. But he was absolutely howled out of Canberra. So I don't hold any hope that we're going to come to any solution.
Yeah, it's a funny dichotomy here in Victoria as well, where we've built a desalination plant, which is one of the largest users, consumers of electricity or power, and we've got it there just in case. And we wonder why there are so many coal-fired generators that are offline for maintenance or being decommissioned. It's because the government hasn't incentivized, you must keep that operational. We'll encourage it by tax breaks. We'll make it tax deductible. Don't use it, but have it there for these exact same things. No one's saying that we don't need to go to a cleaner source, but it's the transition that we seem to have fundamentally stuffed up. We've all rushed towards a fire exit without realizing there's no fire.
It's what I've said elsewhere, and that is there's no green switch. There's no switch ready to turn to renewables. You have to plan for this stuff. And as John has said, the governments around the country, state and federal, have lacked that vision to start planning for the future. And we're all going to suffer because of it.
Yeah. Now,
yeah, Carol, it's hard to plan for a future with technologies that don't produce base load that are going to keep our lifestyle the way we're used to. Without even getting into the arguments of green and dirty and this and that, there isn't a single wind, battery, solar system, and we've just gone down the path for a factory to see what can we do in that area to increase the amount of, if you like, renewable fuel energy we can use, and it's just not there. These people that argue this stuff are arguing something that is just bull. It is just, it's a lie. And yet they seem to have got this political sway taking this lie and saying that showing that there are votes in it. And you start to worry that the populace is now voting on something that is a con. You know, if it was real, I know so many business owners, if there was a real way of putting a panel on a roof to run some of the equipment we have to run, and that was free, you think you're telling me they wouldn't do it? They wouldn't pay? You'd pay a fortune to get that up and running.
But we've also just seen the Andrews government constantly reduce the tariff that they will pay for home generated solar back into the system. So while the energy companies are going, oh, no, we can get more for it elsewhere, that option doesn't apply to people who have gone to the trouble and invested. And some of them invested on the premise of, well, you know, I think it started at 60 cents per kilowatt, and now it's down to around a couple of cents per kilowatt. And if you put a battery in, you're going to get even less. So they're arguing against themselves.
The problem you've also got, sorry, go on.
Solar's only, rooftop solar's between 1 and 2% of power. It was quite useful when there was a dip. There was actually a dip in demand of electricity over the last couple of years. And as certain power stations went offline, that kicked in. It was quite useful. But again, like, it might get to 4%. If you put in a wind turbine at home, it's really, really expensive. It's about 100 grand, 70 grand to put in. But these are, I've heard in this, it's the lunatics running the asylum at the moment. I was having a discussion the other day with one of these green acolytes, and he swore black and blue that batteries generated power, right? So it's serious, right? So,
but this is what I'm saying. Like we have the people. Sorry, John. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's a mainstream thought from what's coming. If you look, and then the blame game starts. Adam Brandt's going on about, and the nationalisation of power is coming back on the table. You know, there's all types of these arguments. So it's deflect, but there's not what I always said about the climate emergency. Show me one project, show me one plan that you've got to get out of it. Crickets.
I said this before, and that's always come back to this one. The teachings of Marxism has 10 points, and most of them it's nationalizing the things, schools, economy, and everything else. And this is my fear seeing again as we spoke about this. But if you put everything on the side, people gonna have the less food on the table, which is gonna cost tremendous amount of the money. We have the burden now of the cost of living, electricity, the gas, and everything else, and nobody talks about this from government point of view. I don't see it. Instead of this, everything's just being talked about, as Caroline says, we're going to bring the tourists, we're going to bring this, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. The current, right now, we experience something, doesn't happen every day, but we experience that inflation, and nobody talks how we're going to deal with that inflation. When it's most of the people really cannot make it, they cannot meet end. As John says, more interest rates going to come from RBA towards the end of the year. So I like to see government talks about this, how we're going to deal with the situation now, not in the future.
When you have a, sorry, when you have a communist.
Yes, Ian.
Okay, when you have a communist country, under as you said, under Marx's doctrine, it's nationalize everything, and effectively, the workers take control of production. In a good democratic society, when a worker wants to take control of production, we call it small business.
Yeah, and let's not forget, small business accounts for more than 90% of the economic drivers in this country. And I know as a small business person all my life that I think at my peak, I had 8 employees, and there were weeks on end where I didn't take any money out, where I managed to pay the bills, pay the staff. That was the main thing. So if you wanted to talk about an hourly rate, I was well below the minimum, but I was paying in. But then some of the levers that businesses do have, because one of the many things I'm not is an economist, but one of the levers that businesses do have, government does have to increase productivity, is get out of the way of business, stop with the permits, the penalty rates, all of these things that make it hard to do. We saw the recent Deloitte report that said Victoria is the worst state for small business or for business to do in. More permits, more compliance, more ridiculous jumping through hoops. We've just seen the Andrews government increase costs for builders with their permits and registrations at a time when construction work is struggling. That can actually help with inflation, because my understanding with inflation and the RBA raising the rate is it's normally a consumption problem. We're spending too much money. Whereas this particular problem, it seems to be a supply side. So there's a scarcity of product. It's not that we're spending too much buying volumes of it. It's just supply and demand. I can get a premium for it because it's limited. So I need to put prices up, which again, cost of living goes up. And those at the bottom, we can have targeted relief for those. And it can actually help with tax compliance and get rid of the black economy, where if we base it on tax returns and go, you know what, you've earned under $18,000, here's the relief based on you, rather than going blanket. Here's 5.2% for the lower economy, which doesn't help pensioners, doesn't help those on social service support, it doesn't help those right at the fringe. And, it just seems like a pointless exercise with the interest rates, in my opinion.
And don't forget, Michael, that we're in a global economy, okay? So if other countries put up rates, we have to follow suit. What happens if we don't? So the terms of trade crash and your currency falls out of bed and free fall. So we have to follow suit. We have to, I've mentioned before, 70 to 80% of the housing debt in Australia is borrowed from short-term borrowings, mostly in Asia. So we have to compete. We'd have to put rates up to compete, to keep that capital coming in. Otherwise, everything would fall through the roof. Look, I had the pleasure of being in the Melbourne CBD last Friday, and it was absolutely dead, right? Unbelievable. On the way back out to the Macedon Ranges, one difference I noticed was I drove past the airport. The long-term car park was absolutely full. 3 weeks ago, it was about 20% full. Now, is that a shape of things to come?
Maybe. Can I also say that while I agree with you about the global economy, the RBA, and this applies to most of the banks, most of the central banks, they did what they call it, quantitative easing, where they reduced rates. They got down to a point where they couldn't stimulate the economy anymore because there was no more rate reductions below zero, and negative territory certainly isn't particularly good either. But then, so the rate rises, which then fuels inflation, devalues the currency, and that in itself, you probably won't get an argument from Treasury about that, because that actually reduces their debt burden. And after having gone through COVID, they'll be quietly saying, yeehaw, let's get inflation rocketing along for a little while and reduce our overall debt burden.
Yeah, but there's a flip side of coin of the inflation, which Australia it yet to see. That is when the people stop spending money. Europe, it's already slowing down. Even they're in summer season, they're slowing down with the spending money and consuming things. What's going to happen when Australia start hitting the spring and people don't spend any more money and they have no desire to consume anymore? You know, I mean, the petrol, the necessities and everything else. Then there's going to be a big problem, particularly for Victoria, which is, as Michael says, all these permits and, people are leaving Victoria. That's going to cause the big problem. That's nobody sees in the future. John was right. We need to follow the suit of every country in the Western society, interest rates and everything else. But there's a problem when the inflation becomes a negative, and that's when the people stop spending because they have no money, no austerity. They don't have no money, literally, and have no desire to spend anything in economy.
It's also fear, Mario. It's the fear of spending. So they won't necessarily save, but they're also not spending, if that makes sense. Yeah. They'll make ends meet, but the things that they might have been planning to purchase, it's just not going to happen.
Caroline, if I just can add on this one, I'm not sure do you see the news from the Sydney, but there's a last couple of days there was a news being run in front of Department of Immigration and Home Affairs. The line, kilometers line long for the passport, for Australian passport. And I'm wondering why so many people sitting there day and night to get Australian passport. Are they leaving Australia for good? This is what I was starting worrying about, things like a kilometers long line in front of Department of Immigration, people waiting for the Australian passport.
My spouse was caught up in that because she's off to in a few days. But they're like, my spouse and my son are dual citizens, which opens the door for me as well. But the passport blowout was 12 weeks. She had to renew my son's passport. So she stood in a queue outside Melbourne, the same thing.
I've been waiting 9 weeks for my daughters, John, and haven't heard anything about it. So where to from here? Obviously, things are going to get harder. Mindset is going to play a lot in it. As you say, there's a lot of negativity around. I've seen, with my clients, I'm spending a lot of my time sort of talking them back from the cliff, trying to, just calm down. What will be the switch? How long are we in for it? Again, what can we do?
I'll just say quickly that being a bit older and having these experience of recession, I smell a recession coming.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with you and John on that. I think if we go back to when interest rates kicked and we had the situation of 17% and those sorts of rates that sent people to the wall, caused huge amount of mortgage stress. I mean, in the area we lived in Victoria, Patterson Lakes, there, blocks of land which had been selling early 80s for $70,000 rocketed up to 250. People were borrowing money at 8-9%. Everything was great. Then the recession hit. Then it all collapsed. Keating cranked up interest rates. And what did we see? We saw people who'd paid up to $250,000 for these blocks of land suddenly quitting them. I watched an auction where a guy was wringing his hands as he quit a block, losing $150,000. So he'd paid this $250, bang, it went back. Now, though, when you think about the cost of housing and what people were borrowing then, the 17% is what wiped people out and caused huge problems from everyone from. The problem now is we've just through a period of very cheap money. So the quantum debt is so much higher.
Anyone want to finish that?
Leanne's gone, but yeah, I mean, overcommitting, that's where the problems start. That's where people start to default on their mortgage. And again, the vicious cycle of debt versus their ability to service that debt.
Yeah.
Look,
Have we had it
yes.
too good for too long?
Yeah, exactly. And that trains the brain to say, yes, this is okay. We can go boots in and all. And then only to find out that they're neck deep in debt. So
In
you might
inflation,
start
in
out
inflation, two
shallow.
things grow. You're gonna see, Victoria, like two things I know from inflation. The law enforcement apparatus grows and their salary grows. That's the first number one. And secondly, it's gonna be a lot of investment into the PR. That's usually it's a case in inflation when it's come. So I'm hoping that Ian and John and Caroline is going to be as they say, but I'm going to incline towards what John says. I smell recession big time now, big
Yeah.
time.
And we
Yeah,
see the social
absolutely.
impact, especially you, Caroline, and you, John, in your field with family, domestic crime, all of the flow-on effects that happen with stress, which,
Yeah.
and the government can get in front of this now by getting their ducks in a row now, because this is coming. It's foreseeable and it's somewhat able to be mitigated. So it can't be stopped, but it can be addressed a little bit better than what we're currently doing, because we're currently not meeting needs in this area, and it's only going to get
Yeah.
worse.
You're
Yeah.
so right, Michael. John and I will see an increase in the incidence of family violence. We will see separation. And the irony being that just compounds the problem. You need more money to run two households. You need more money when you're separated as opposed to living under the one roof. Children will miss out. This is obviously an area of great concern to us as family, given that we both do family law. But it's the violence that's going to, we'll see that first, and then we see the deterioration of the relationship, and then we see the separation, and then we see children going without.
So one of the
So
things I'd
sad.
actually like to see the government step up and change is child support. I'd like to see it be paid by the government and then recouped through tax or anything like that, so that as we see people default on their child support obligations to the other parent, the government should be paying it first, and then they should be going, right, well, this is on your tax bill, sunshine, for not paying for your kids, so that it's not compounded the problem with those that it's designed to help.
This breaks my heart what Caroline says, that domestic violence is going to increase and nobody blinks the eye from the government. And this is the tragedy, that we heading towards a storm and nobody's prepared for the storm except the people who are working with the people like Ian, like John, like Caroline, and yourself, Michael. That's
All right, on that cheery note, we've got to wrap it up there, team. So thanks for another one. I've got a lettuce that I've put a bid in on that I've got to rush off and see if my offer's been accepted. So Caroline, Mario, John and Ian, thanks so much for your time, and see you all next week.
Thank you, guys.
No
Thank you, Ian,
Bye.
John, Michael, Caroline.
Bye.
See you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.